Hey folks, this is Kalani. Patch 10.2.6 didn't go live this week to the disappointment of many, but we are finally starting to see some new information make its way through the woodwork. In a blue post today, the dev team unveiled some huge changes coming to dungeons in Season 4. Almost every dungeon difficulty is going to be much harder, but reward you with better gear. The Mythic Plus system is being cut down and streamlined, and overall, gearing up could end up being quite a bit easier. There's a lot of information in this post, so let's break it all down. Now before we jump in, be sure to hit up that like button and subscribe so you never miss another video. We finally have our first look at what will be changing as we head into Season 4 of Dragonflight. This should be the last season of the expansion before we move on to the War Within, and from what we understand it should be a fated season just like the end of Shadowlands. That means we might see quite a few experiments thrown in just to change things up a bit more than a usual season. The first big change we have to look at is for dungeons and how that endgame option is going to work going forward. So in previous seasons we've had normal dungeons and heroic dungeons which reward very similar item level rewards on the lower end of things. These difficulties are the only dungeons you can queue for using the random group finder, and the Mythic 0 was a little bit higher than that, but you have to make and join groups manually, and then Mythic Plus takes over and scales the difficulty and rewards up to the current maximum. With how close the rewards for normal and heroic dungeons are, they're more or less the same thing, and most folks skipped over those difficulties entirely to head straight into Mythic 0 or just the lower end of Mythic Plus keystones. This left the bottom end of dungeons kind of empty, so that's one of the main problems the dev team is trying to address. In Season 4, normal will stay where it is, down at the bottom, rewarding you with the lowest item level gear. Heroic dungeons will be moved to where Mythic 0 dungeons usually are, but you will still be able to queue into them, so be able to get the equivalent of Mythic 0 dungeon gear through the random group finder in Season 4, giving you access to much higher item level gear when compared to previous seasons. Now the difficulty will also match Mythic 0, so heroic dungeons will be quite a bit harder when compared to previous seasons as well. So you do get better gear, but it's not going to be for free. You still have to overcome the difficulty spike to get your shiny loot. Curiously, Mythic difficulty changes and mechanics will not be included, so while things like health and damage of monsters should be scaled up, mechanics will remain limited, so the difficulty spike shouldn't actually be too bad. Speaking of difficulty spikes, Mythic 0 dungeons are moving way up in the world, and they will be about as hard as Mythic Plus 10 keystones were previously and reward the equivalent item level gear. They should be a bit easier because they won't have any affixes, so that means no fortified or tyrannical, as well as no smaller affixes like volcanic or bursting, etc. But that still leaves Mythic 0 dungeons being much more difficult when compared to previous seasons, and vastly more rewarding. The other super important factor is that because they are Mythic 0 dungeons, they will not have a timer, and each boss should drop loot individually. That means you can take as long as you want to progress and complete the dungeon, and even if you don't make it all the way to the end, you can still get some loot from each boss individually. Mythic 0 will still remain on a weekly lockout though, so your available runs will be limited. Mythic Plus then picks up after that as per usual, just starting about 10 levels higher than normal, so we'll head into plus 2s and the current rewards cap out at plus 10. Affixes will be introduced at plus 2, plus 5 and plus 10, and dungeon ratings will also be equivalent to what they represent in the current system, and achievements should be updated to follow the same progression, so completing all dungeons on a plus 5 should give you the same rating as completing all of the previous season's plus 15 dungeons, and we will probably then see portal rewards for plus 10 keys in Season 4 instead of plus 20. Now thankfully Blizzard also gave us a nice little progression chart to help visualize these changes, so we can see normal stays the same, heroic moves up to the Mythic 0 position, Mythic 0 moves up to where Mythic 10 used to be, and then Mythic Plus continues as normal. You can see that these changes will definitely streamline the entire endgame dungeon system and squish everything together a bit more. You should also see fewer ranges for Mythic Plus key levels and groups. Instead of plus 2s up to plus 20s, the vast majority of folks will just be running 0s or plus 2s to plus 10s. Now it's important to stress that the difficulty at the top end there is not supposed to change that much between the points being compared, so a plus 5 should be about as hard as a plus 15 previously, a plus 10 should be around a plus 20, so the top end isn't really changing that much outside of the number attached to the keystone. We're just cutting out the first 10 Mythic Plus keystone levels and moving the starting point up. The blue post also gave us a chart of gear rewards to look at, so we don't have to guess how these changes will affect the reward structure of dungeons, and it also then gives us an idea of what item levels we'll be working with for Season 4. This might be hard to read for some folks, so with a bit of magic we can whip this into something that might be easier to read. So right off the bat we can see that the rewards for heroic dungeons are increasing significantly. Remember that you can run these as often as you want and you can queue into them, so getting a group should be easy peasy. This update is really going to change how folks gear up and just make dungeons more relevant, especially at the lower end of things. While heroic dungeons should be harder than previous season heroic dungeons, they should also be a bit easier when compared to previous season's Mythic Zeros due to the Mythic mechanics not being included, so it's still very accessible for all types of players, you just get way better gear for doing it. Another huge item level jump comes in for the weekly vault rewards for completing heroic dungeons. So not only does this make gearing up easier for everyone who can run heroic dungeons thanks to the higher gear from the dungeons themselves, but now you can also properly take part in the weekly vault system. I know that heroic dungeons already count for the weekly vault right now, but the rewards aren't really worth getting excited over. But with the rewards being bumped up to item level 489 in your weekly vault just for running heroic dungeons, suddenly reset day is going to be a lot more fun. Then we have a big gap to the new Mythic Zero rewards, which are 1 of 8 champion, which is already insane. That's the same as normal raid loot usually, and the upgrade potential on champion gear is huge, and that's clocking in at item level 493 in Season 4. So you will be able to get 493 or higher item level just for running Mythic Zero dungeons. The weekly vault also goes up to 506 or 1 of 6 hero gear, so champion gear from the dungeons themselves, and then hero gear from the weekly vault, and that's all without stepping foot into a Mythic plus keystone. So no affixes, no timers, just Mythic Zero dungeons. I think they definitely hit the mark here when they were aiming to make these dungeons more rewarding. From there we see the usual expected increments as you work through the Mythic plus Keystone system, ending with 509 rewards from the end of +9 dungeons, while the weekly rewards will cap out at 522 from completing +10s in the week. That also gives us an idea of where Myth gear is going to cap out. If 2 of 4 Myth gear is item level 522, then 4 of 4 Myth gear should be 6 item levels higher at 528. So we're going to be running around in much higher item level gear as Season 4 progresses. Now while I love the idea of streamlining the system and offering higher item level gear for the non-timed versions of endgame dungeons, this does cut out quite a few stepping stones in terms of gear progression. There's a 16 item level gap between normal and heroic dungeons now. That's pretty huge, and overcoming that difficulty gap could be challenging for some newer players or more casual oriented players. But then there's another 17 item level jump between heroic dungeons and Mythic Zero dungeons, and you'll have extra mechanics and abilities to worry about in the dungeon. This creates a much larger difficulty gap when compared to the previous heroic to Mythic Zero dungeon spike, so while the system being more streamlined certainly looks easier to break into and it's more accessible for folks who don't usually push higher dungeons, it might actually end up being harder to get a foot in the door. There are some ways to reduce that difficulty gap though. First, you're going to be spending a lot more time in heroic dungeons. You can spam them as often as you want, giving you much easier access to higher item levels of adventurer gear. Second, upgrading your gear is going to be a lot more important. With the upgrade feature, gear rewards aren't really static anymore, so you can upgrade items to help bridge the gap to the next tier of rewards. And third, you're probably going to need to pay attention to other sources of gear. Heroic dungeons reward 4 of 8 adventurer gear, so your upgrades are going to be limited. So anything that rewards you with veteran gear will give you a few more upgrades worth of item level to help you tackle the new Mythic Zero dungeons, where you can then pick up champion gear and move on from there. This will probably include any new group events in the open world, as well as the raid on LFR mode. But I think that the main point of these changes is to make Mythic dungeons mean something. They're now going to be worth struggling through to get those higher rewards. They're on par with other endgame activities without you having to deal with the timers and affixes that make Mythic Plus dungeons more complicated and stressful. It's kind of like 5-man raids now, or at least that's where it puts the gear levels. Who knows, maybe in War Within we could see some interesting changes to dungeons themselves that work alongside these difficulty adjustments to make dungeons better than ever before. Now, there are some other notes about these changes included in the blue post that are pretty important. So Flightstone earnings should scale in the same way they did for previous seasons. Bonus Flightstones for increasing any party member's score will remain. Whelpling crests will no longer be available from Mythic Plus dungeons. Mythic 0 dungeons will reward 10 Drake crests upon completion. Worm crests are going to drop from +2 to +5 keys, while Aspect crests will drop from +6 keys and above. So most of these rewards will work in more or less the same way as they did before. We also now know that the Season 4 dungeon pool will be the 8 original Dragonflight dungeons, which would make this the first time we've seen all 8 together in the Mythic Plus system. This also makes a lot of sense progression-wise. We'll be doing the same 8 dungeons through Heroic, Mythic 0 and Mythic Plus this time, so learning mechanics should be more straightforward when compared to previous seasons, where we had all the dungeons making up at least half of the Mythic Plus dungeon pool. Another interesting knock-on effect these changes are going to have relate to some weekly event quests, mainly the Mythic Dungeon Weekly Event quest. If that quest remains the same going forward and you have to complete 4 Mythic dungeons, that will be significantly harder and more involved in Season 4 when compared to previous seasons, but I imagine the dev team would change the requirements to 4 Heroic dungeons instead to keep the difficulty of completing the weekly event the same. Arguably, that would actually make it easier, as you would be able to randomly queue for Heroic dungeons, cutting out the part where you need to manually form a group, and Heroic dungeons are shaping up to be easier than Mythic Zeros were previously, so either way you slice it, I think the weekly dungeon event is either going to be much harder or a little bit easier in Season 4. This will definitely be something to keep an eye on either way. But perhaps one of the most important little details that a lot of folks probably missed is that on the chart showing the old versus new difficulty points, the new stuff is labelled Season 4 and 11.0, so these changes aren't just for Season 4 and the end of Dragonflight. It looks like this is how dungeons will work for the War Within expansion as well. I am really curious to see how players react to these changes. Personally, I think I'm going to really enjoy this streamlined setup. I basically ignored Heroic dungeons past the first few days of hitting max level right at the very start of the expansion, and we've always jumped straight into Mythic Plus whenever a new season comes around. So with these changes, Heroic dungeons stay relevant for much longer, Mythic dungeons start off with more of a challenge and reward way better gear, and the Mythic Plus system is more condensed, and on top of all of that, it's going to be easier and faster to gear up your ults later on through Heroic dungeons. Those are all pretty big positives for me, but what do you think from what you've seen so far? Will these changes have a positive or a negative impact on how you interact with dungeons, and do you think you will approach dungeons differently moving forward? If you're a player who doesn't usually do Mythic Plus keys, are you interested in trying the higher version of Mythic 0 now that it has no timer or affixes? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon and to all of our members here on YouTube. You can see the names floating by on screen. If you'd like to add your name to the end of every video with a special shout out at the start of the next video, you can find links in the description over to Patreon or click the join button just below this video. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another video. Thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.